Pintel said nothing to Ragetti for the next 2 days. That was only mostly out of anger. The rest of his reason, ironically, was because he was too furious to think of anything cutting enough to spew at that backstabbing little sneak. He turned over a few ideas in his head while they'd gathered their belongings for the Merryweather's voyage. Jabs about Ragetti's missing eye, his illiteracy, his inability to speak to anyone but his fellow fugitive without coming across like a nervous idiot, maybe even a remark about his father. The closest Pintel had come to saying something was when they had found that Bible in their boat, and he'd realized that the divine entity described on its pages couldn't possibly exist because he and Ragetti had just spent a decade as unliving proof that the Aztec gods were real. He just wanted to sting that little runt the same way Ragetti had stung him, to snipe him with a piercing bite and then slither off to let the venom eat away at him. He wanted that. And yet no words left his mouth. It was just as well. He didn't even know if Ragetti still believed in that Christian hogwash enough for anything debunking it to break his skin. Pintel wasn't sure he knew anything about the kid anymore, except that he couldn't be trusted on his own. Fortunately for both of them, Cambridge kept the pair busy on the way to Jamaica. Ragetti must have claimed a similar list of skills to his bald acquaintance, because his duties also mainly involved swabbing decks and tending to sail lines. However, their captain wisely limited Pintel to more deck-based work, while often sending his younger and lighter hire up into the rigging, leaving the two little opportunity to interact with each other. The times when they did work together were usually spent on something too strenuous for talk, such as weighing the anchor, or on something still involving too many other crewmen to make a scene in front of. Did Ragetti care about making a scene? He'd already been the cause of one when Cambridge had hired them, one that he'd obviously known was going to happen. Pintel would never forget how that cowering little toothpick of a man had literally turned a blind eye to him after the captain had revealed their destination. Of course Ragetti didn't care. All he wanted to think about was Edith. Hadn't it been enough for him to see 7 of their pirate crewmates hauled off to the gallows? Didn't he understand there were reasons why they couldn't go home? Had Pintel honestly not made those reasons clear enough to him over the years? Aye, Pintel had made each of those reasons very clear. Each time a new one of them had conveniently come along. They were all true, though. The Navy would hang him and Ragetti if they were ever caught, and poor Edith probably would have died of fright if she'd ever seen their decayed skeletal forms in the moonlight during their curse. She didn't deserve to see the twisted, hideous monsters that her beloved brother and son had become. The monsters that we were made into, Pintel bitterly corrected himself. The monsters that the Navy, Barbossa, the Aztecs, and the whole rest of this bloody world forced us to become. No worse than what it probably forced her to become. And do you suppose she blames you for that along with the rest of the world? Pintel gave up his petty quest for revenge after their first day aboard the Merryweather, when he sensed that Ragetti was actively avoiding him and keeping quiet as well. Maybe the Weevil had learned his lesson, or maybe he just didn't want to draw any more attention than necessary from their new crewmates. Either way, it finally freed up Pintel's thoughts and allowed him to focus on what lay ahead. He knew his comrade would want to venture into town once they docked in Kingston. That would be a terrible idea. If Captain Cambridge wasn't already suspicious of them, he would be once they reached their destination and heard the talk of the locals. The news of 2 pirates escaping from Port Royal with its own prison's guard dog was bound to have spread to all the neighboring settlements by now. They'd have to make a run for it. As soon as the Merryweather was tied off and her crew allowed to set foot on land, he and Ragetti would have to grab their gear, slip away, and take off into the surrounding jungle. Jamaica wasn't a large island. They could probably cross it on foot in a day and reach its northern shore before anyone grew wise to their whereabouts. Then they could hit Port Antonio and Ocho Rios to try and locate the Black Pearl. This mess wasn't beyond salvaging. Escape artist Abner could still make this work. He just needed to keep an eye on Ragetti in the meantime. That was what Pintel did for the rest of the voyage. He didn't sleep a wink the one night they spent aboard the ship, sitting awake in his hammock in the crew's quarters and watching Ragetti rest at the far end of the room. He spent the next morning and afternoon stealing peeks up at his companion on the rat lines while doing his part to swab the upper decks. Poochie even helped him keep his vigil a few times by barking in his ear whenever the sleepless pirate started to nod off. Or maybe the dog was just doing that to get back at him for keeping those treasured prison keys hidden inside his coat. The Merryweather arrived at Kingston late that evening, just as the setting sun was beginning to dye the western clouds with tinges of peach, violet, and gold. This port was as tranquil and quaint as Baracoa, but it cast an even darker shadow of dread over Pintel as they neared it. That didn't stop him from hastily gathering his things below deck in preparation to go ashore. Ragetti helped him with those preparations, still without a word. The pair stayed close together as they did their part to dock the ship and unload her cargo. Then, for the sake of maintaining their act, they approached Cambridge together to discuss their current standings on his crew. The captain informed them that he was willing to keep them on for the next leg of his voyage, though he kept his exact reason for that decision questionably vague. The two accepted their wages from him nonetheless, and then they were free to take shore leave for the night. Pintel led the way down Kingston's cobblestone street until they lost sight of the Merryweather, and until any onlookers still on board would have lost sight of them. After that, he cut a subtle but deliberate right, swiped a lantern from a street post, and headed for the town's outskirts. He didn't make it to the end of the first block before he heard a bark from Poochie. That was when he sensed that Ragetti wasn't following him anymore. The elder stopped and turned around. There stood his partner in crime, a dark figure splashed with faint orange light from the lamps of the nearby shop fronts. He was at least 20 paces back, and his quietly stubborn face showed that he had no intention of taking another step forward. Pintel squared his jaw and spread his arms in a calm challenge.
"You knows why we can't stay here?"
Ragetti mirrored the gesture, but more imploringly.
"There's always going to be reasons why we shouldn't do this. I'm sick of hearing them. Life just puts you in bad situations sometimes and you gotta work around them."
"That's funny coming from you, since you're the one what put us in this bad situation."
"So you don't care at all about what she's doing?"
Pintel dropped a bit of his gusto.
"I didn't say that."
"Well, then now's your chance to find out,"
Rags urged him more softly.
"I got you this far. You just has to take the last step."
"Don't try turning this into something it ain't,"
the older pirate growled with a stab of his finger.
"You knows damn well who you did this for."
"And what have you ever done for me what didn't also happen to be what you wanted?"
Pintel bristled. Ragetti pressed on.
"We're in this together. That's always how it's been. I gets that we've done things we ain't proud of no more. She might take it as a good sign that we ain't proud of 'em. Means we can still change."
"That ain't what I'm afraid of,"
Pintel retorted. He only realized a beat later that his voice had cracked. Ragetti had clearly heard it too and was equally thrown off by it. The youngster's mismatched eyes grew wide, and he hunched and curled in on himself like a frightened mouse as the weight of what he was risking seemed to set in. He floundered for his next words.
"Well, she deserves to see you. And I want to see her."
Pintel braced himself sadly.
"You really wants that?"
"Aye. Don't you?"
Pintel wavered. He tried to summon a response, something honest that could still sway Ragetti without making himself sound like a coward. But even a wordsmith like Jack Sparrow probably couldn't have plucked what he needed from all the pain, fear, and chaos swarming in his mind right then. In the end, Pintel could only hang his head in defeat.
"I might knows a way to shorten the search."
Kingston's cemetery was the only part of town that felt appropriately desolate that night. It heightened that feeling, not only because of what lay within its hallowed grounds, but also through the wide berth that the neighboring buildings granted it. What little warmth and sound there was to experience in the streets at that hour faded to cold silence by the time they reached those grave markers. Entering the site wasn't difficult. The wooden fence surrounding it barely came up even to Pintel's waist. Once they were inside, he and Ragetti stayed close together behind their lantern and made their way somberly up and down the seemingly endless rows of graves. They could have covered that ground in half the time if they'd split up, but Ragetti couldn't read the names etched into the stone in wooden markers, and those needed to be read tonight. Pintel said nothing as he led the way. The lump in his throat was so large that he could barely even breathe. Each grave they passed was like a test of his nerves, a face-off that ended in a draw and left his stomach twisted tighter and tighter with dread. He would have loved nothing more than to turn and bolt from that cemetery and never look back, but he knew he had to see this through tonight. There could be no returning to Kingston after this. What if they did find Edith here? What if they didn't? What if they searched the whole town tonight and found no trace of her anywhere? Would that be the end of it? Would he and Ragetti finally stop wondering about her, give her up for dead and move on? Or would those unanswered questions fester in their hearts and compel them to hunt for her across the Caribbean, across the whole world, as two doomed souls, unable to rest or be free or make peace with their mistakes until they located someone they may have already lost forever? Would she become their new curse? All of these questions battered the inside of Pintel's skull as he kept guiding Ragetti up and down each row of their harrowing march. And then he saw it. It was like a pistol shot straight through the chest. He stopped in his tracks and went rigid. Then the shockwave receded, and he slowly began to process what he was looking at. Once he knew, he could still only stare. There it was right in front of him, almost trembling in the flicker of his lantern light. The name he'd written on countless letters and envelopes. The name that had been seared into his mind worse than any pirate brand ever since he'd begun his life of crime. Now it was carved in crooked, uneven letters on a warped plank of wood jutting up from the ground. Her name.
Pin?
Ragetti called softly beside him. He hadn't sensed what was wrong yet. He faced the grave marker across from them then, and failed to speak again. Pintel didn't move. It was like he thought the name was some sort of threat that would pass over him if it didn't detect him, or like he was in some terrible, half-lucid dream where he'd forgotten how to command his own body. He would have preferred for either one to be the case, but he knew that was foolish. The grave in front of him was very real, and very, very permanent. He made his eyes shift down to the date on the marker. It took him a moment to calculate, but he figured out quickly that it was from 5 years ago, right in the middle of his and Ragetti's time with their curse. The Navy couldn't have hanged them back then. He and Ragetti couldn't have died at all. The two of them could have come here, maybe given her a piece of their plunder, and then slipped away before the first light of the moon. Maybe they could have, but they hadn't. Because he hadn't wanted to. Because he'd been too ashamed of himself to face his sister. Now he'd never see her face again.
Pintel?
Ragetti called again. It was clear from the waver in his voice what he meant to ask. The pain in Pintel's chest was spreading up his throat. He felt his jaw tighten and his eyes ache. Saw the letters on the marker start to grow hazy. He could tell Ragetti whose grave it was. He could give the lad his confirmation and end their search. In just a few words, he could finally deliver that sting he'd been wanting to deal his shipmate for the past 2 days. Pintel could do all of that. But he still said nothing. He couldn't hurt Edith's son. Not when she was right here. His gaze sank to the ground. Just to his right, among the patches of grass and weeds, was a cluster of small white flowers. He bent down and picked one, hesitated, then picked a second one with it. Pintel handed the first flower to Ragetti. He placed the other on top of the grave marker. It was a feeble gesture, but it was the best he could do, and nothing more was ever going to be enough. Once Ragetti's slow, stiff hand placed his own flower on the marker, Pintel turned and trudged away. He heard Ragetti start to follow him after a minute. He heard the dog following him too at that point, like the animal had been waiting for Ragetti. Pintel didn't care. He kept up his pace all the way to the cemetery's fence, and once he was over it, he headed straight for the trees. The pirate drew his sword as he entered the jungle and started hacking his way through. He was vaguely aware of Ragetti and Poochie behind him after a while, but that only quickened his pace. He needed to be less aware of everything behind him.
Pintel growled and slashed harder into the vines and brushes ahead. Just this once, he wanted to forget who he was. He wanted the same simple, beastly mind that had once taken over Ragetti to seize him this time. For the first time since Isla de Muerta, he wanted to feel nothing again.